The grain testing process, when we keep hearing about MRLs and these levels and so forth, the typical process is that grain is tested on what's called outturn. So in a larger, more bulk-like commodity, so let's say like chickpeas now, where you've got multiple growers delivering into one receival point up country, and then that ultimately ends up being loaded into a boat or into a shipping container. Those samples are taken at the point of loading that container or loading that boat. So that's known as outturn. So we do end up with a degree of commingling and potentially even dilution of those residues through that grain being commingled from different paddocks and different growers. So that works really well in our advantage most of the time. So the problem becomes when we exceed the MRL, when it's been tested. There's two questions there. One is if it exceeds the MRL of the destination market. Now the exporter has the question or the difficulty of where he puts that grain, because there's every chance that market won't accept it. So he's potentially got to look for another market, another country that maybe has a higher MRL set, so it meets their requirements. And that all takes time and cost, and we all pass costs on, so it gets a bit nasty. But it's manageable. If it exceeds the domestic MRL, now we've actually got a bit of a problem. And this is why it's so important we actually follow labels and we do the right thing. Because in actual fact, grain that exceeds the domestic MRL isn't tradable. It's illegal to sell it domestically or overseas. So yeah, managing these things is really important. I'm aware of instances where there's been issues in an overseas market and the grains had to be rerouted to a different market. But yeah, look, as an industry, Australian growers do a remarkably good job. The biggest issue with adherence to MRLs and what it's meaning for trade is when there's not transparency, particularly for the marketer, that he wasn't aware of an issue or a risk. Those mechanisms have been put in place, likes of the vendor declaration, to help everybody along the supply chain. And as long as we all do our bit and we do it honestly and openly, then yeah, the system works pretty well. So when it comes to pulses particularly, and also some oil seeds, the final product, so the grain that we're producing as Australian growers, is very close to what's being consumed. For mung beans and chickpeas and faba beans, they take that grain, they may crack it in half, boil it up and eat it. So it's very close to human consumption as to what's leaving our paddocks. Whereas with some of the other grains, there's a much higher degree of processing. There may also be a much higher degree of other things going into the final product, if that makes sense. Whereas if you sit down in some Asian countries or India, somewhere like that, you sit down to a big plate of chickpeas. It doesn't, it's 99% Australian chickpea that person's eating. So it is important, therefore, from a human health point of view, a dietary intake point of view, that they know what they're consuming. And that goes right back to when the MRL is set and being set in that country, those sorts of considerations are taken in.